Welcome back, folks. My name is Dustin Cormier. I'm continuing this video. This is part 2 of the prosperity and annihilation of a house, as per Ryan Kurczak's Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship program. This is tropical astrology. We are talking today about the chart of Jim Morrison, specifically a essay that I wrote for Ryan's apprenticeship course, which you can check out the full thing of on his site, ashevillevedicastrology.wordpress.com. You can come all the way down, you can see Jim Morrison's astrology. I'm basically piggybacking on the word that I did in that essay, in the work that I did. So, thank you very much for checking me out. Once my screen starts blurring itself, we're gonna, there we go. Cameras. So, to continue on, I'm just going to get right going, and we're going to talk about Jim Morrison's chart. Now, I'm going to say a little intro, and then we're going to get into the guts of 4 houses that I think are prominently emphasized in Jim Morrison's chart. And I should say now that at some point, I'm kind of blending the emphasis of the 4th house with the 6th house, because the 6th lord is in the 4th house. But essentially it's the 4th house, Jim Morrison's early life, his capacity to gather the resources he needs to feel at peace within himself. That is the emphasis we're coming at with regard to the 4th house. Now, I'm just going to start getting into essentially the text that from my essay that you can read on Asheville Vedic Astrology's website. Now, Jim Morrison was a guy who had a sort of double-edged success. A lot of his success, as I've read in his chart through the eye of the Veda, really comes from a deep sense of contentment, coming from strength gained from Mercury as a Rashi aspect, coming from essentially having the benefic moon in the 4th house, which is a great place for the moon by Digbala. Even though, again, I should mention, we're not talking about Shad Bala in this course, in this lesson. We're not talking about Jaimini. We're not talking about even Graha aspects or yogas, which are usually, we're not even going to talk about Rahu or Ketu, which as we can see would be a huge thing for Jim Morrison, Ketu being on the ascendant cusp. We're not talking about Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, which is usually an emphasis, and it is for Jim Morrison too. We're specifically having this lesson to talk about the prosperity of a house, the Bhava and the Bhavesha. That's the house and the house lord for Westerners. So, that's where this is coming from. And I would contend that there's a huge emphasis of the strength of Jim Morrison coming from his 4th house, and that prominently placed moon exalted in the 4th house. The moon, as we're going to talk about, is also a Karaka for the 4th house. So the moon having strength here in the 4th house helps his early life. Jim Morrison's early life really helped him to deal with the heavy Aquarius ascendant, the 10th house emphasis, and the aggression of his 3rd and 10th lord Mars being right next to Saturn, Saturn being his 1st house lord. These are all the themes that we're going to talk about in this essay. Starting with the moon in Jim's chart. So, all of these influences combined to create this sardonic and satirical, yet strangely optimistic persona. These contrasting elements are what manifested the enigmatic black and white tones, which we all know and love in the life and work of Jim Morrison. He could be so dark at times. He could be so heavy and so aggressive and pushy, as we all know. But so many of his friends, so many of his lovers, and the lyrics of his music often have this ironic uplift. Even though they talk about such hard, dank, tough realities, it has a sprig of optimism in it, a certain inner wellspring of optimism. And that's what I'm trying to get at with this chart analysis. Yeah, I'm going to keep that there. Let's see, I'm just going to make sure that you guys can see what I'm doing. Good, good, good. So, first thing we're going to talk a bit about is his strong moon in Taurus in the 4th house. It's kind of a mix of the 4th and 6th house vibe here. We've already talked a lot about his 4th house in our previous video. This is kind of getting at a more of a biographical sense of Jim Morrison himself, not just the nuts and bolts of the 4th house prosperity. So, much of what creates a sure-footed, confident person lies in the building blocks of their early childhood experiences. Jim Morrison's positive family upbringing, it couldn't fully remove the heavy karmas promised in his chart, but it did do wonders for his capacity to find stillness within himself in the difficult things that he brought upon himself. In Jim Morrison, we see a well-educated mind, on one hand, contrasted with an unrelenting spirit that's hungry for personal expansion and all the things that we know of Jim Morrison's shamanic side, shall we say. Some positive prospects in early childhood are shown by the 4th house. And the 4th house is a significator of one's emotional environment when they're growing up. It's the bottom of the chart, as we can see in the Western sense. The 4th house is kind of like the roots, the underpinning of the chart. So, we can see that the benefic moon, as we've already noted, is waxing. That's why it's benefic. It's almost full, and it's in the sign of Taurus, which is the moon's exaltation point. In fact, I don't know the exact exaltation point right now, but I might even be there. It's not just the sign of Taurus that is the exaltation point. It's actually degrees of Taurus that represents this. So the exaltation point is the best sign for any planet to be in. The best degrees for any planet to be in. And as I've noted, the moon in the 4th, the moon is a natural karaka for the 4th. As we know through Vedic astrology, more in Vedic astrology than anything, the Western doesn't talk about how the houses each have karakas that are, a karaka means significator. So a karaka for a house means it's a planet that deeply relates with the tones of that house. Astrology is very complex, much more complex in my opinion than the Western astrology makes it out to be. So each planet is sort of a carrier of the tones of the houses, regardless of the rising sign. The rising sign changes the house emphasis. So we see in Aquarius, Pisces is the 2nd house. Aries is the 3rd house. Taurus is the 4th house. And the house lordship turns based on the rising sign. But the moon is always a karaka, a significator, for the themes related to the 4th house, no matter what your rising sign is. So having the moon in the 4th house is a double emphasis, typically for better or worse. Usually this kind of shows that the field of the 4th house and the tender of that field, let's say the moon is the gardener of the 4th house. Wherever the moon is, it's going to be carrying the karma of the 4th house. So the moon being in the 4th house means that the gardener is in the field. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing because it's a double emphasis. I wish I could think of an example. Let's say the sun being in the first house. The first house has the karaka of the sun, because the sun is the significator of identity. If your sun is very ill placed and it's in the first house, that means that not only is the first house hurting, but also the karaka is hurting. Let's stay on task here. Essentially, in Jim Morrison's chart, the emphasis of the moon is doubled because the karaka of the fourth house is in the fourth house, and thankfully for Jim, the moon is well placed in Taurus. In the fourth house, it has strong Digbala. It's opposite Venus. Its Lord Venus is in the 10th house. It's a pretty good place for the moon. Pretty strong fourth house. Now, as we've already noted, we can observe that through Rashi aspects, the moon also gains some support from Mercury in Capricorn. It's not necessarily a trine aspect that we're looking at here, although the Mercury probably is trine the moon. But when you deal with trines, you also have to deal with Lajitadi Avashtas. You have to deal with Agraha aspects, which is a whole different thing. Mercury is basically usually a natural benefic, unless it's right next to a malefic. But Mercury helps to support the agenda of anything that it Rashi aspects. We note that any planet that's in a cardinal sign is going to Rashi aspect all the fixed signs except for the one right next to it. If you want to know more about Rashi aspects, which is something that they do not talk about in Western astrology, Rashi means sign, by the way. It's a sign aspect. If you want to know more about that, Ryan gets it from Parashara, and Ryan talks about these aspects in his first year of his apprenticeship course. I have a feeling that he talks about it on his YouTube channel as well. Maybe I'll do a lesson on it for Ryan just to get it out, just to get the thing. So feel free to research for more on that. But essentially, this Mercury is in a place where it's supporting the agenda of the fourth house. Not necessarily the moon, not necessarily by Graha aspect. We're just talking about Mercury helping out Taurus in the fourth house. So Mercury being in the 12th house, you have to blend in some way. You have to blend what that means. Mercury being in the 12th house, it is aspecting the fourth house, and both of these are moksha houses. So Jim would have been interested in contemplating, in looking within himself, because Mercury's here. Mercury's lending planetary activity and strength to the 12th house and giving Jim the capacity to look within himself. We know this with his shamanic ways, with his very intrinsic internal eye that he often burped up in his lyrics and just in the way he was. He did give himself, he was inclined to possibly even meditate and contemplate things, to isolate himself from others. This loner quality we get from the Aquarius ascendant, but not every Aquarius ascendant is also going to look within. We can imagine that Mercury being a moksha house being in a moksha house in the 12th aided the fourth house in this way. You know, I like to show, what does it mean that Mercury is helping the fourth house? I'm trying to get at what that means. They're both moksha houses, and they're both concerned with liberation and detaching from annoying things and the outside world. So this would positively affect his emotional foundations in the fourth house, this Mercury in the 12th. Now, another thing we're going to talk about, first thing I should say is that the sign of Cancer is a cardinal sign. Cancer is obviously the lord of the moon, the sign that rules the moon. And Venus is also Rashi aspecting Cancer, which looks good on his 6th house. Now, we're going to talk about the problem, the unfortunate thing of the 6th lord being the moon. As we can see, Saturn rules the 1st. Leo is the 7th, so Cancer is the one just before the 7th. So Cancer is the 6th house from Aquarius. And for better or worse, the 6th house tends to lend inauspicious qualities to the planet because of its aggressiveness, its constant neurotic need for some kind of satisfaction, particularly in the nervous system, typically. Relates with Virgo. Constant routines. So we could see that Cancer being the 6th lord, there would be a desire to constantly feel satisfaction, to feel self-satisfied, to release the emotions, to unclench the emotions. And the life of Jim Morrison is kind of rife with this sort of theme. We could see it in his alcoholism, in his drug-induced vibe. Not every person who's a shaman who's interested in contemplating within is also like an addictive personality. Having the moon as the 6th lord has a bit of tones of an addictive personality. And the 6th lord is in the 4th house. 4th house is trying to find inner peace, calm, chillness. So even though the moon is well placed and everything we've talked about that's helping the 4th house, it's still the 6th lord. Some things you can't get away from. Not only that, but the moon is in Vrida Avashta. As we can see, Vrida Avashta. It's kind of like the old retired state. Between 6 and 12 degrees of an even sign, like Taurus, we call it, the planet is like getting old. It's not as young as an adult or a young adult. So it loses some strength there. This again comes from prosperity as given by Parashara. Look at the first video to figure out where I'm getting at with that. So, we can imagine that Jim may have been constantly preoccupied, 6th house theme, with feeling good, Cancer in the moon. This is an attribute which may have contributed to his alcoholism habit later on. The moon's mostly positive here, though, and the 4th house is mostly pretty good. Even sometimes the 6th house emphasis can be good. We might say that the 6th house is blending with the 4th house here, and the 4th house in astrology relates with like education, with a desire to constantly educate oneself. Now, you might think that Jim Morrison is a druggie and he's, this sort of loose guy who doesn't have an intelligent mind, but he was very well educated. As we're going to talk about Venus being in the 10th house. But we could see not only his parents helped his education and pushed his education hugely, but not only that, Jim Morrison was interested internally in constantly satisfying himself, probably with literature and education, constantly expanding his mind. The 6th house desire to be satisfied was in the 4th house, which relates to education, bringing resources to oneself. So he, what I like to say is that the constant conquest, 6th house, of education, 4th house, could provide Jim with a soothing neurological axe to grind, especially when he was younger. This bodes well for the high education that Jim eventually received from his parents in university, not to mention his own introspective curiosity. Jim's education in Jungian psychology and the mythos of Friedrich Nietzsche is often lost on his fans and detractors alike. I get a lot of this from a book on Jim Morrison called No One Here Gets Out Alive. I've read a few things on Jim Morrison and a few biographies on him. I love the guy. I'm a huge fan of his. So not only is this sixth lordship in the fourth going to give him a constant desire to satisfy his desire to build himself from the ground up, fourth house education, but his fourth lord was in the 10th house. We see the fourth lord of Taurus, Taurus being his fourth house, right? First, second, third, fourth. Taurus's ruler is Venus, and Venus is in the 10th house. So there's also this education and this constant axe to grind in furthering himself in his career and his opportunities in life. This is also presented in the fact that the fourth lord is in the 10th house of Scorpio. So we can see here that it's an annoying thing in a way, because Venus and the 10th house emphasis has its own funky things that it's dealing with. But nonetheless, the Venus is like the moon. It's helped out by Mercury, and it is in the 10th house, the most active of houses. So we should also note that Parashara says that Venus is the most auspicious planet for an Aquarius ascendant. So Jim Morrison's family invested in his education in his youth. His dad was well-to-do. His dad was a wealthy guy, and it helped Jim to gain opportunities to expand in his education. His dad was a military dude in the States, and he was well-to-do. So the money and the reputation of his father as a military dude helped Jim to have a high society intellectual consciousness and to be pushed to that regard. His family paid for Jim's education in university in order to see him grow into a respectable name for their family. In spite of all this, in spite of all the education that Jim had, and he was well educated, he did get good credentials in university. Eventually, he wanted to take his whole, wherever he was going with it, and he wanted to put it in art school. He wanted to be an actor. He got into film. He was going to eventually even direct films. He was very interested in that. And once he got older, once he started awakening his own capacity to live his life, it was the 60s. He got into the hippie jams, and he got into hanging out with other people, expanding his mind, and the other weeds in Jim Morrison's charts, shall we say, started to grow around the flower of this very strong and well-placed fourth house. Not to say that all of this stuff is necessarily bad. I'm a bit of a hippie myself. I'm interested in psychedelics and all these sorts of things. Just checking that I'm good here. As long as you take it with discernment, with right purpose. Ultimately, I'm a yoga guy. It's better to do all this stuff from within. But you're going to do what your karma calls you to. And Jim's karma called him to explore his consciousness in the ways that the people were doing it at the time. I would say Jim is an ironic example of a person who's, even though he had this comfortable fourth house, it's ironic that his smooth, comfortable existence in childhood, conferred by his wealthy parents, it's not always enough to satisfy the evolutionary appetites born of the spirit. Jim Morrison had some work to do in his soul and his spirit, and he even had a bad taste for the prestige that he was given in his upbringing in a lot of ways. At some point, he just sort of said screw it and went to live on the beach and do acid and drink and hang out with people on the beach. And there's stories in his biography of him just living on top of an apartment in a little shelter he made. He would steal avocados from the surrounding trees in California. He lived on avocados, oranges, and cans of beans and acid for like a long time. It was around that time that he was just on the beach one day and that he met Ray Manzarek of the Doors, and they started doing their thing. Now, that is a whole lot about Jim's 4th house, his early education, and some themes that we can see in regards to the prosperity. Why his 4th house is prosperous, and also what the 6th house does to the 4th house, all these sorts of things. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is Jim Morrison's 1st house of Aquarius. As we can see, this is for Westerners. The ascendant is in Aquarius. It has K2 there, but we're not going to talk about K2 because K2 has so many implications that Ryan, I'm not even far enough yet in Ryan's apprenticeship course to speak as clearly to K2 as I would like. I know a lot about it from my own reading, but I can't wait to actually get Ryan's take on it. We're going to talk specifically about the ascendant in Aquarius. Now, we could talk about the prosperity of the house, which, by all technical means we should. But I think that I've given you guys a good hunk of what makes a house prosperous. Excuse me. So I'm just going to keep rolling along with my interpretation of Jim based on my essay that I wrote. I'm really excited for this particular part. Jim Morrison was a certain special brand of cosmonaut. Cosmonaut is a word that I like to use. Naut, N-A-U-T, relating to like astronaut. The word comes from like nautical. If you know SpongeBob SquarePants. If nautical nonsense be something you wish. Nautical means like you put in a suit and you explore explore inside the suit in a world that you're not usually typically able to do. A cosmonaut is someone who's exploring the suit of the cosmic body, the astral bodies, the spiritual nature, etc. So his concern was not necessarily always for material comforts, although he did enjoy his material comforts, but more of his ascendant drive, his sort of soul, like all the purpose of the material luxury that he kind of drew to himself was to experiment with and observe the alchemy of elements in the soul in his own way. He wasn't exactly necessarily an occultist or an esoteric person, but I would contend that he had these qualities naturally in spades. Sorry, I keep just wanting to check that my computer's all good. So, since his first lord, the lord of the self, falls in the 5th house of honest, curious Gemini and friendly dignity, it's technically, it's not a great friend. It'd be better if Mercury was closer to Saturn. It's neutral dignity, if anything. But I digress. Saturn does good in any sign of Mercury. And this is the 5th house, a trinal house for the Aquarius, which is another good thing. So, we know the tones of the 5th house relate to recreation, to creativeness, to discernment through experience. And it's the first lord in the 5th house. Always a strong thing. So this suggests that Jim Morrison's creations, 5th house, would likely denote the flavor of self-awareness. 1st house, self-identity. Saturn as the keystone of the rising personality in the 5th house gives us some insights into the magic behind Jim's uncanny ability to put his own growing pains into a musical language which most people could relate with. We can see here that this is Saturn in the 5th house of Aquarius. He had an uncanny ability to put his own growing pains, 1st house, into a musical language which most people could relate with. 5th house discernment, right? Certain stories can attest that Jim's Saturnian front gave him, his Saturn nature, gave him a notoriety as a tough, rather abrasive personality in his day. He's just such a rough guy, you know? But somehow, those close to Jim Morrison have continuously held him in very dearly and in high regard while he was alive and long after he was gone. So how can that be? That somebody can be abrasive and tough, but for people to respect it and love it? Goes to show that just because Saturn is a malefic doesn't mean that it's not a necessary part of our cosmic body, a necessary contributor to the energetic light of time and of the lessons we need to go through in life. He had the Saturn abrasiveness, but it was in the 5th house, and it was in Gemini, his Saturn, his first lord. And it was intelligent. It's almost like people knew that even though he was like this, you still wanted him around because he's going to tell you what he really feels. And no one else might do that. He's not a yes man. He's going to tell you what's going on. So this contradiction lies in the fact that he had a mostly innocent, curious, Gemini-flavored pleasure, 5th house theme, in playing the role of the community coyote shaman in his group circle. And he would curiously prod the parameter of his friends' sanity, it's an Aquarius ascendant theme, in order to draw clarity from the reactions that he evoked from their egos. You know, nobody wants to deal with someone like that at some level, but if you're a shaman yourself, if you respect the spiritual evolution, then you can get a lot out of a person like this. Being experimented upon by Jim's curious mind must have been a daunting prospect for those who did not understand his motives, especially when the haunting specter of his own ego, Jim's ego, in the form of the malefic influences to his ascendant, surfaced. Not only his K2 in the ascendant, but also Mars, the aggressive Mars, being with Saturn. Saturn and Mars don't necessarily get along. And this is an Aquarius chart. So to have the first Lord Aquarius right next to the 3rd and 10th Lord Mars, which is a very important, it's the 10th Lord Mars. But it's blended in this chart with the 3rd Lord, because Aries also is ruled by Mars. So we can see that Aries rules the 3rd house and the 10th house, Scorpio. The 3rd house is this aggressive, Gemini-ish toned. I mean, even Mars is a Karaka for the 3rd house. So the 3rd house quality gives Mars even more of this abrasiveness. In a way that's kind of negative. It does more bad than good to the personality. Yet people could still love Jim Morrison for it. It's this weird thing of like, okay, Jim, I get it. You're telling me what I need to hear. Just fuck off. Excuse me for swearing. I shouldn't be swearing for this video. So, at this point, I also would point out that Saturn was also in Vrida Avashta, in the retired dead Avashta. The 10th Lord's doing good in Yuva Avashta, that's Mars, and we're going to get there when we get to the 10th house. I digress. So we can imagine how frustrating Jim's presence must have been for those who Jim took as his subjects, as well as for Jim himself. He couldn't help but he had a character that he called Jimbo, and it was this really demented South American accent that he would come through, and it was like a hillbilly thing that he just drew out of himself in order to kind of fuck with people, and to mess with people, I should say. So, and even for himself, just his nature coming out like this, there was parts of him that was a very nice guy, you know, and like he wanted to look well to people, but he also wanted to have a certain freedom to say what's on his mind to people for this coyote shaman vibes sake. So he took it upon himself to appoint himself the role of Saturn for others, He didn't say it with that language, but that's the language I'm using as an astrologer. He wasn't an astrologer. This mentality can be seen in the proper light as an interpersonal gateway to heaven through the furnace of hell when understood in its proper place. It was under the guise of positively apprehending the limits of the personality and breaking through them that Morrison crafted some of his most inspired poetry. I'm sure you guys know this little line. We chased our pleasures there and dug our treasures there. Do you still recall the times we tried to break on through to the other side? To break on through to the other side. Break on through, break on through. We could see that line really reeks of Jim Morrison's coyote shaman vibe. You know, we chased. I love these lyrics, and I love that I put them in this essay. Jim Morrison was a great poet, and his lines, obviously anyone watching this would know this, his lines just reek of a coyote shaman vibe, positively apprehending the limits of the ego. We chased our pleasures here, we dug our treasures there. And that's like the materialism that I'm talking about, you know? He did it. He did the materialism thing. But what was his real intention? Do you still recall the times we tried to break on through to the other side? For Jim, it wasn't about getting to the destination. It was about breaking through walls in the ego. A true shaman. For me, the Saturn emphasis of his toughness is very emphasized in these lines. Although, again, there's more to this shaman thing. When we see K2 in the ascendant, when we see the sun in Sagittarius, haven't even talked about his Navamsha chart. Jupiter as the Atmakaraka in his Gemini. There are plenty of things that can point in this optimistic direction. I would say Jupiter as the Atmakaraka was a very interesting, positive, benefic attitude that he had, along with the moon in the 4th, that put the tough Jimbo way of his Saturn, this malefic ascendant, in a positive light. You can see the split going on there. Very interesting consciousness. The fact that Saturn's rulership was also shared by the 12th house of Capricorn is not lost on us as well. We can see that obviously for an Aquarius, Saturn rules the 1st house as well as the 12th house. The secret energy behind the workings of any Aquarius rising tends to come from the trance-like mystical promise of bliss, inner bliss emerging from the 12th house. Mercury being there helps the 12th house, but this bliss is, sometimes ignorance is bliss, and it doesn't always come through the best way. Without any higher values, this 12th house tied in factor is vulnerable to be sucked in by the abysmal desire to rid oneself of the tension which the Saturn-ruled personality is bound to collect in the physical body. In the emotional body, Jimbo coming through would cause tensions in his body and between other people, and he would want to just rid himself of it in a 12th house mystical trancy way. Unfortunately, the intense focus which Jim placed on his role as shaman interlocutor for the public and for his friends, wrapped up with 12th house drug-fueled escapist tendencies, might have been the straw that broke the camel's back and ate him in the long run. Now, I would like to say that the 3rd house that I kind of emphasized in this essay was the 10th house. Having benefic Venus here helped the 10th house to grow. There's a lot, if we were to look at the prosperity of the 10th house, there's a lot that we could talk about. Mercury is aiding the 10th house. It has a benefic in it. The Lord of the 10th house is in Kumara state, as we can see. Gemini is an odd-numbered sign, right? As we can see from Parashara. The Kumara Avashta, the adolescent planet that's still young in the soul, still has plenty of teenage energy to help it with as a planet. That's just a critical part of the analysis of a house lord. In an odd sign between 6 and 12 degrees is Kumara. So this Mars is young. It's full of juice that it can use to expand itself and get itself out of its old ways, old karmas, to meet reality as it comes and deal with it. We could also see that the house lord is, well, Gemini is not the best place for Mars. It's not great by dignity. It is not awake. It's not in the 10th house. And it is not aspecting its own house. So there's good and bad here. I'm inclined to say, there's other things about the Mars we could discuss, like Shadbala. The Mars in the 5th house, any planet does good by being in a trinal house. But it's very close to the 4th house cusp here as well. So Mars does better when it's in the 10th house. It's closer to the 10th house. So a lot of his aggression is coming in the 5th house. It's being fueled into his own little artistic ventures, which can cause aggression because he's not expressing it in a way that's going to fortify him, or he's not going to be able to see the build-up, the constant build-up of his Mars energy. If Mars was closer to the 10th, he would see it in the public and others would congratulate him for it, which did happen. But it wasn't necessarily his Mars energy that they were congratulating him for. I guess I digress. Obviously, Jim Morrison got a lot of recognition. He was a celebrity in his day at a young age. But it didn't necessarily satisfy his Mars, per se. His Mars energy, even though the external reality was there, internally, his Mars was more focused on creating through this 5th house energy, which the 5th house is great in general. It's an auspicious house, but it's not the most satisfying way for Mars to express itself, especially in Gemini. But all of that is, I guess I should say, right now we're trying to emphasize what makes the prosperity of a house and a house lord. The 10th house is doing okay, having a benefic here, Mars being in a Yuva state, being supported by Mercury. There is a lot of good here. So, Mars was another arbiter of the character and virtue which would share prominence in Jim Morrison's life. It's the 3rd and 10th lord, as we've said, and this kind of shows that in a sportsmanship sort of way, he would try to keep up his career. Sportsmanship and career are tightly wound together for the Aquarius rising, because sportsmanship and constant conquest relates to the 3rd, and career relates to the 10th. So Jim Morrison was one whose recreational experiments on the brink of poetic self-exploration, the 1st house lord, 1st house and 12th house vibe of Saturn. This was blended in with his career, and he would sportively fight to keep the friction of his career and of his status amongst others in the air wherever he would go. Probably had a bit of an ego to him. It's annoying that, we can't... I love Jim Morrison, and us as people who love Jim Morrison, we often just look at his work and say, wow, what a mystical, inspired, intelligent, illuminated, enlightened figure he must be. But it's just because it's his work expresses this doesn't necessarily mean that his personality wasn't fighting in an aggressive way to stay on top of other people and even to step on other people's heads. It's a thing that Jim probably did. We note that the combustive sun had 53 points of Kashta in Jim's chart. I don't have that here, but we had been reading about Kashta at this point in my astrology course when I wrote this essay. Kashta is a figure that's something that I'll probably, once again, if Ryan sees this and he wants to encourage me to do a video on it, maybe I will. Ishta and Kashta are important in Vedic astrology, showing like how much a planet can express its ill flavors, essentially. Every planet has good and bad flavors. A well-placed planet probably won't even have that high of Kashta. It's just kind of how it works, but I digress. The sun was very capable of sharing its negative qualities, and as we can see, the sun, the seventh lord, which has Rahu in it, so the seventh has a desirous, venomous quality to it. It's in the 11th house, the house of ego, the house of gain and fame and name, and it was opposite Mars and Saturn, the 10th and 1st lord. Mars being 10th, Saturn being 1st. So this egoic 11th house and 7th lord vibe probably burned and absorbed the energy Jim needed for his own grounding, where his poetic soul was concerned. Mars and Saturn took 52 and 56 points of aspect from the sun. Basically, it's the direct opposition here. And also the sun took an aspect from them. So there's a lot of real tense energy going on here for the 10th lord and for the 1st lord. Of course, the first house and the 10th house, mainly what we're trying to talk about in this lesson here. The sun caused some damage there. So Mars is a friend to the sun, and it probably worked better with this demanding 7th house lord. The demandingness of the 7th house lord and the 11th house probably did a bit less damaging to Mars than it was to Saturn. Saturn is really getting flanked by Mars and the sun here. Really hard. Conjunct Mars, by Vedic terms, I should say it's associated in the same sign as Mars. And it's getting flanked by the sun's opposition. So the Saturn, the 1st lord here, which enjoys being malefic and tamasic and slow. Saturn's about stability and constant slowness, and this is what I have to do to stay alive. The 7th lord, the sun, really burned that capacity to survive, which we expect in Aquarius ascendant. Usually Aquarius is very serious about my needs, and doesn't matter what, like that's Saturn at its best, is when it's unapologetically doing what it needs to do for its own survival first. Because any tree can give of its fruits much more strongly if the roots and the trunk are strong in itself. This is a Saturn for whom he was kind of giving out to the fruits and ignoring his root, shall we say. The sun, as the 7th lord, he probably wanted to wheel and deal with business contracts with his band. Particularly, the sun is the 7th lord in the 11th. He had this band, and he probably gave up much of his own capacity to be stable for his band, for his music, for this thing that he did that made him Mr. Celebrity. And it also kind of burned even his 10th house as well. It burned Mars a little bit too. Although the aspect again to Mars, it kind of helped each other because they're friends. The Lajitadi of Ashtas would say that the sun gave energy to Mars and Mars helped to ennoble the sun by this band that he had. It was tough on his body, Saturn, tough on himself per se, but it was still good for his career, still good for his capacity to do his karma as a celebrity. Jim worked well in a group, and his close association with group objectives may have made his first lord rather claustrophobic. It's unfortunate that in the end, the fruits of Mars and the Sun were destined to grow so heavy that they would break the central stalk of the tree, being Saturn. Now, as I say in the last part of my essay here, the positive potential displayed in the use of Jim's natal Tamasic planets, Saturn as the first lord, blended with Mars, which is technically still a Tamasic, malefic planet anyway. These are malefic planets. And there's a sad reality being expressed here, because he could have had the capacity to use these malefic planets to great effect, and he did in his career. And there was so much positives going for him. It's too bad that he died, because if he hadn't, he would be an excellent example of Aquarius ascendant, a tough shaman who will tell you like it is and will be deathly real. All of these are tough malefic qualities, but even malefic qualities have their place. Aquarius ascendant people can be tough, and we can love them for it, because we need toughness. They're being the boss. They're being the ones making sure that the annoying parts of reality are being in check. And we can love them for that, even though they bring it. They bring these malefic energies to our awareness. Jim Morrison was someone who could use them constructively. And there's nothing more glorious than malefic Tamasic planets well groomed by the sands of time and experience, if and when they do fully bloom. Morrison's life was a bottle of vintage wine destined to be dropped on the floor and never fully enjoyed. His story is that of a tragically flawed, relentlessly honest poet whose heavy malefic influences were too interwoven with his more transcendental qualities to let those qualities shine. It's upsetting that the influence of his benevolent moon couldn't carry the heavy weight of his rough character. And it's no stretch of the imagination to suspect that the positive, artistic potential of a malefic-riddled natal chart like Jim Morrison's will be hard to come by again, because he almost made it. Anyone who has such heavy malefic influences, we can expect not to last too long. And he could have. Such a sad thing. That would have been some good vintage wine, but it was dropped on the floor. Such is often the nature of these malefics. Now, we could talk about how Aquarius ascendant has several planets that are considered Marikas. We could talk about Mars probably being a Marika, having evil house lordship qualities, being associated with the first lord Saturn. There's so much more that we could talk about here. But, ladies and gentlemen, this video was essentially my description of a lesson on the BHAVAS and the BHAVESHAs, the house lords, as is taken from Parashara and as is described through the lens of Ryan Kurczak's Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship program up to year 2. Now, I'm going into year 3 in this February, and if Ryan's into it, and if you guys are into it, I'm going to do what I can to contribute to the Veda by, as I go into year 3, continuing to digest what I've learned and to express them for you guys here on my channel, How to Rock Astrology, with the respect and grace of my teacher, Ryan Kurczak. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I hope that I did somebody that I deeply love. I hope I did Jim Morrison justice. Again, maybe I'll do another video of Jim after I've done my full astrology program, and you can see how much more of the tones I've learned about Jim Morrison since then. But I'm glad I did this video because this was a sort of introduction to how to calculate the strength of the house lords from the house perspectives. Eventually, I'll do that. I'll do a chart of Jim Morrison talking about the full scope. But for anyone who wants to know the full scope, talking about the yogas, Jaimini Karakas, Graha aspects, so many things, Lajatati Avashtas, Rahu and Ketu. For anyone who wants to deal with the crown, the flower, you have to deal with the stem and the root and the things which bring out the bloom of the flower. And this video, talking about the houses, is a good little backdrop into how much goes into the crown jewel that we would talk about as the yogas. The crown jewel as the rising sign and the planetary lordships. These kinds of things. In Vedic astrology, there's a lot to know. There's a lot of groundwork to be done before we can really talk about the health of any planet that we would love to just see. We would love to just look at a Western chart and see, oh, look, Venus is opposite the moon. It must mean this. Saturn is conjunct Mars. That must be necessarily a bad thing. You know, there's so many assumptions that we could make here. And that's why I wanted to do this video for you guys and for Ryan Kurczak. Thanks so much, folks. I'm Dustin Cormier for How to Rock Astrology. See you on the flip side. Woo!